Okay, so good afternoon, and thank you again for being here, and thank you again to Marcia and the organizers for inviting me. So the title of my talk is indeed, well, the conflict sites in bilingual speech. So we will be discovering or discussing an underexplored, but I think highly interesting conflict site, namely the conflict between synthetic morphological strategies and analytic lexical strategies in two Spanish-English contact communities. Namely, we will be looking at data from El Paso and Miami and compare these two communities. So we will see how bilingual speakers manage these conflict sites. And so to set the scene, I brought some, real-life samples from the areas. So one hand para el cafecito, the other por la croqueta, that clearly shows the code switching. Or in the other one, se habla español most of the time, which would be something that you could easily find there as an announcement for a hotel. But of course, as you will see, there are other situations such as borrowings or calls, carto solo, no dinero para atrás, you don't get it back, which of course, para atrás in monolingual Spanish would not be a good expression. So I brought 3 goals for my talk today. So first of all, I would like to talk about the phenomenon of language contact between Spanish and English overall, and so give an overview of the different views. So it has been evaluated positively, negatively. Well, I think that to understand what is happening in those communities, it is interesting to summarize what has been said there. Then I will define some methodological challenges, because it might seem easy to look into the speech of those bilingual communities, but well, we were confronted with some data problems. And then finally, I want to discuss that particular conflict site in the bilingual mind by looking into 2 case studies. Well, we will see if we have enough time, because I brought a lot of data. So namely the diminutive construction and intensification strategies. So, of course, these goals will also define the structure of this talk. So, what is happening with bilingualism and languages in contact? As most of you in this room probably know, the USA has known over decades and centuries, in fact, a lot of migration coming from Latin America towards the north. And in fact, there are also historical situations of contact, but they have profoundly changed the profile of the US, the cultural profile, the social one, and of course, also the linguistic one. And if you look at the map, then you see that, of course, at the border between the USA and Mexico, so in Texas, in California, you have a lot of bilingual communities. But in fact, bilingualism can also be found so here in Miami, in New York, etc. And you can imagine that the type of bilingualism will not necessarily be the same. Maybe something that is most present in our collective memory are the caravans of migrants that started, I think, around 2018. But in fact, you could find news on these caravans in every year that followed after. So I also found at the beginning of 2025 also a new migrant caravan approaching the US, despite the election of Trump. So I don't know if it's still going on, but this is something. Yeah. Yeah. Oh, interesting. Huge. A caravan, but I don't know if they really get it. Yeah. Yeah, in California. Yeah, with the riots. So it's really a social topic and a political topic, of course. But we are linguists, so we will be interested mainly in the different results of language contact, which in fact in the literature have been called Spanglish or Spanglish. And even the Royal Dictionary of Spain has written a lemma about Spanglish, but in fact it's quite short. So it's just called a speech modality of some Hispanic groups in the United States in which lexical and grammatical elements of Spanish and English are mixed. So this is really a very broad definition. But the topic itself of Spanglish or Spanglish is a much debated topic, in such a way that even the term Spanglish is avoided. So I also prefer to talk about Spanish-English bilingualism. But it's interesting to know that it exists. And as I will show in a minute, there are positive and negative views. And what will be interesting for our case studies, I think, is the discussion regarding the linguistic status. Is it a dialect? Do they speak languages in those bilingual communities? Are they Creole languages? So, well, we will try to see whether with our data we can offer an answer. Now, in the project that I will be presenting, I will be arguing for the need to have an integrated approach. So I think that if you want to understand the grammar of bilingualism, also the grammar of code switching, and find the patterns, this is, of course, highly interesting, but that's the starting point for your description. You always have to take into account the social profile of the speaker, sociolinguistic characteristics of the communities, etc. And until quite recently, those two research areas were quite separated. So here you could find a generative linguistics mostly, and here, well, that was the sociolinguistic study. So just to give you an idea what the atmosphere is when you start to work in that domain of Spanglish. So some really say that mixture between the language is really a sickness of both monolingual modes, so both of English and Spanish. Whereas others, they call it not a sickness, but a dynamic fertile system. So that is a totally opposite opinion, but note that they use the same metaphor. Some say that those mixtures only arise when speakers are totally ignorant. So you cannot speak Spanish, you cannot speak English, you do Spanglish. Whereas others say, well, you can only produce those correct mixed modes if you are a highly competent speaker in both languages. Then you can also see that some say that, well, you cannot find a grammar. There are no patterns. It's all about linguistic chaos. People are just doing something, whereas others say, no, it is a third linguistic system. It is rule governed, etc. And then finally, so this is what is happening, I think, also in the US. For some, the fact that you have Hispanics in the US with their own language, they feel it really as a threat to the culture to their own American culture. But even Spanish speakers sometimes say that, well, we have to speak Spanish even when we are in the USA because, well, we are mixing with English, but we are a different group. Whereas others say, no, those mixed modes, they show that we have a very particular Latino identity. Now, again, coming back to the discussion on the linguistic status, I don't know if there is a possibility to remove or to see the whole screen. So it has been defined as a dialect. So the examples that I will be showing, it has been said that, well, they are a dialect, but then there is discussion on, okay, is it a dialect of English or is it a dialect of Spanish? Because, yeah, you always have to define the point of reference. Some have called it a kind of psycholinguistic dialect. So it's just present in the mind of the speakers where you have a mixture of neurological networks. And what I found also quite striking was that at some time, well, it's quite some time ago, but even now you can hear linguists that say, yeah, but they are like Creole languages, meaning that, Creoles, they are more complex than Pidgin languages that occur when languages are in contact, but still, so even those Creoles, they are much simpler. So it's all about making the two languages more simple. Now, I believe that after having looked into corpora and data for quite some time, I would say, I think that's not a very interesting discussion, meaning that if you are a functional linguist, if you are a cognitive linguist, I think that we then all share a certain number of notions on what we think human language is. And in fact, if you then study those corpora of those bilingual speakers, I don't see any difference. So what I would then propose is that, let's skip the positive negative view and say, okay, language is an integrated faculty, meaning that the way I speak is determined by why I speak with whom. But, the same goes for those bilingual modes. Language is symbolic, so it forms meaning pairings. And if you change the form in any monolingual mode, the meaning also changes, which could also mean that if people code switch, the fact that they go from English to Spanish and back, it also has a meaning. We also know that language is quite systematic. This is because of the principle of productivity. So with very few rules, we can produce a large amount of sentences. Well, this also goes for the other speech modalities. But on the other hand, so we have grammars. We are also quite creative and flexible. So if I want to adjust my language, depending on the context, I can do that. And this is also what you see in those bilingual speech modalities. Okay, so having said this, let's go back to the language contact phenomena. The result from all that is that we will look at bilingual speakers not as a combination of two monolingual speakers, but what we get are, of course, mixed linguistic repertoires. So it's not that a Spanish-English bilingual combines Spanish and English and can separate it. No, it is a mixed repertoire. Oh, now you would have to click again. It doesn't work anymore.
It doesn't work?
No, just, click on the slide. Yes, voilà. Thanks. So it's a bilingual mode that has a mixed linguistic repertoire, and the underlying mechanism that is important is convergence, meaning that what the bilingual speakers do, of course, is that there is convergence and there is a process of increasing structural similarity between the languages in contact. The outcome of those processes of convergence are, of course, contact-induced changes that we will look into. And these changes can be direct or indirect. So what are direct changes? So direct changes would be the borrowings that I showed earlier on. For instance, he pulled up en la troquita, that would be a borrowing. But of course, a direct change is also code switching. So when you really go from one language to the other. Oh, también me salía este. Do you think that's a good one? So that is a direct contact-induced change that is directly observable. But what is also very common and, less visible, but I think more productive, are the indirect changes. So these are changes result of language contact that do not imply the transfer of material directly. But what you see is then that there is a phenomenon in the first language that is already present, and that phenomenon might change by the contact with the other language. So this might lead to morphosyntactic simplification, for instance, or it might lead to the extension of a phenomenon that is present in language A. So for instance, Spanish in contact with English, since English has pronouns and Spanish is a prodrop language, you could expect that the Spanish spoken in New York might have more pronouns. So that would be a case of indirect change. Okay, so with all this in mind, let's now have a look at what we can do with the two communities we are interested in. And so, as I said, there is a quite severe data problem. So yesterday and today, people have been talking about preserving data. But, well, here we are a phase before that. There is a problem of, where can we find the data? And of course, if you want to know what happens spontaneously in the mind of a bilingual speaker, you want to know how that bilingual speaker acts in his or her natural environment. And, well, I think we agree there are different types of data that you can use, but it would be very useful to have those spontaneous, informal corpora. Now, these are are available in a very limited extent. So we also thought that, well, we will have to contribute to this problem if we want to do research on these topics. And in fact, it is quite important to continue that work because already here at the end of the 80s, there was a director of the ASALE, that is also a Spanish Royal Academy, that said that, well, we all think of languages as monolingual settings, as, okay, you have Spanish. When I'm here in Brazil, it's about Portuguese, et cetera, But in fact, monolingualism is an illusion. All communities are like multilingual. So, why don't take an effort and try to record the speech of those bilingual speakers? Now, going back to the US, so this is like another way of representing the different communities I showed at the beginning, so you see where they are situated. So this is a whole continent, and you can imagine that, as in Brazil, there will be a lot of linguistic variation among these communities. So there is no uniform Spanglish either. Now, we did the job of, looking for data as well, oral data at least. That would not be, we worked with novels as well, but we wanted to know how do they speak? And well, we were quite disappointed because for that whole continent, we just found 7 corpora. I think that is quite reduced. So they are listed here. And then we said, okay, 7 corpora, we can do something with those data. But then we are like, okay, but they are very different. Some are based on sociolinguistic interviews. Some are based on experiments, so picture description tasks. And very few of them really have spontaneous conversations. Okay, so you cannot compare apples with pears. So we had to be careful and not compare all these data. And then we thought, okay, let's take out just the sociolinguistic interviews or whatever and do work with that. But then there was another problem, a problem that was also discussed over the last couple of days, namely, do we have access to the data? And then we were quite shocked to see that many of the corpora, they are just on the computer of the principal investigator, or there is a website, but the link doesn't work, etc., etc. So from those 7 corpora, we ended up with just one that we thought, okay, that's a corpus that for our purpose could be useful. And that was the Bangor Miami corpus of conversations. And it has a great website, so you can access it online. So we took this corpus also as a starting point to try to create a comparable corpora. So what did we like about the Miami corpus? It's a bit what I told about the Corma corpus. If you just listen to the conversations, you see that they are ecologically valid. People speak naturally with their friends when they're on the street. And so as I said, we took them as a starting point. Now, today I will be presenting some case studies, which in fact are part of a broader project of comparison of communities. And so after a long, many discussions, we ended up with 3 communities: Miami, Florida, El Paso, Texas, and something that is of course not situated in the US, but where Spanglish really is the norm, or code switching is the norm, and namely Orange Walk in Belize. Now, why did we in the end up with Miami and El Paso and not with LA, where, as you could see in the news, there are also many bilingual speakers? Well, the fact is that these 2 communities, they seem to be similar, but in fact, they are quite different. So what do you get in Miami? In Miami, about 70% of the population says that they have Hispanic origin. And let's say almost 1/3 is of Cuban origin. So it's quite a melting pot. If you go to Miami, there are Hispanics from many other countries, Latin America as well. Whereas not unsurprisingly in El Paso, so you have a percentage of 80% of Hispanics, but 3/4 are Mexican. So this is not really a melting pot. So this is interesting if you want to see to what extent the dialect of origin still has an impact on those contact varieties. Now, what else? As to the number of participants that say that they speak Spanish at home, so the heritage speakers, that would be, so they are quite similar. Also as to bilingualism, so really have the 2 languages in a balanced way. There is more bilingualism in El Paso than in Miami, but still. But what you do get is that in Miami, English is the dominant language. So also the Cubans who live there, they like to speak English and Spanish. Whereas if you go to El Paso, you think that you're still in Mexico. So there you would say that you have Spanish-English bilingualism. So these profiles, in fact, are very interesting to compare and to see to what extent, although these differences exist, they give the same results in contact settings or not. So what is the Bangor Miami corpus? As I said, So it is a corpus that was recorded in 2008, so colloquial and formal conversations, and it was recorded by a bilingual research assistant, meaning that it was not someone from Europe who went to Miami and say, okay, here do the recordings. No, it was someone from the community. It's a corpus of about 35 hours of recordings. And so that corpus served as a really template, an example, to later record our own corpus in El Paso, so at the border with the US. So Margot van Haverbeke, who is one of our PhD students, so she's really the principal investigator. And so in collaboration with experts from Leiden and of course someone from the University of Texas in El Paso, so we recorded the corpus. So what is the result? So a highly comparable corpus. It was, of course, it's more recent. So it was recorded in 2022, 2023. So also spontaneous conversations, bilingual research assistants. And so it's a bit smaller. So we have 31 hours of recordings. Now, just to give you an idea, this is quite similar to what we had with the Korma corpus. We have more female speakers than male speakers. We have speakers from different generations, but something that we have to be aware of is that we have many speakers here of Gen 2. Those are not the adolescents. So in the US, you cannot work with children. If it's already complicated to get ethical approval in Europe, in the US, it's really hard. So we worked with young adults. Those are the university students. So in Miami, the profile is more varied. Here, most participants were university students because they could get credits. And the idea was if you do recording, you get a credit for a course. And of course, we have, again, a complex data set. Interestingly, and I think that's also an added value of the corpus, there are really detailed sociodemographic questionnaires. So we ask them to report on their language knowledge, but also on what they think themselves of those mixed modes. So if someone talks to them in Spanglish, do they like it or not? And so we have all that information. So this is how it looks like. So everything that is in red is Spanish. What is indicated in blue is English. So you see that the mixed speech modality is really present in that data set. And so if you're interested, you can have access if you just write us an email, and then you can see all the data that we have collected at a SharePoint from our university. Okay, so let's move on and look into the conflict side between what we call synthetic and analytic construction. So many people have studied, for instance, the expression of pronominal subject, etc. So we wanted to do something else, or expression of number or gender, but there are so many things that you could also investigate. So what I will be presenting now is work in collaboration with two PhD students. So there is a work by Margot van Haverbeke on the diminutive construction. So she's defending her PhD in 2 weeks. And so there is the ongoing work by Simon Claassen on the intensification strategy. So maybe this might seem a bit random, but well, of course, this is not random. Why are they two topics of interest that you can put together in an overall research project? Well, the diminutive and intensification, you could say that they are like near universal primitives. So what does it mean? It's almost present in all languages. All languages I know, you know, have the idea, the concept of intensification or attenuation or diminutive. But interestingly, the way it is expressed in a language system is very different. So what happens when those different systems are in contact? What else? Both diminutive and intensification strategies within one particular language show a lot of dialectal variation. I think if you would look at Portuguese here in Brazil, the way intensification is expressed, you will find a lot of variation. So if you take then the analysis of bilingual speech as a variationist study, well, you should also see variation here. And then finally, so there are many different ways of expressing intensification and diminutives, but you can clearly separate them and see what is morphological or synthetic. So, really, as in the typological term, so put together, or a way of expressing them by lexical or analytic means. So to give some examples, in Spanish you have la casita, in English the small house, in Spanish hijito or hijito, which would be dear son. So you already see synthetic, you see analytic. And the same goes for intensification. El casón is the big house in English. Llegó súper tarde or tardísimo would be in English very late. So again, you can see that contrast. So what do we want to do with these phenomena? So of course, we want to check the effects of language context. So how are these constructions used in bilingual speech? What happens in the bilingual mind? Is there some conflict or not? So we will look into signs of direct change. So is there code switching within these constructions or not? So these would be the signs of direct change. And we will observe signs of indirect change that are more implicit. So what happens in this grammar? And this at 3 levels. So as to the productivity, so if the phenomenon is very frequent or productive in language A, more than in language B, what happens in the context setting? Is there any reduction or not? So this is really about frequency. Also about, of course, the formation strategy. And so we have that conflict between analytic and synthetic. What does a bilingual speaker do? And finally, there is also something to say about the paradigm itself. So do you see then a mixture of English and Spanish forms, or is there a fusion, or is it just that the Spanish forms are then preferred? So these are like the parameters and the criteria to investigate the phenomenon. Now, of course, I can do that using the El Paso corpus. I can do that using the Miami corpus. But yeah, I cannot compare with English and Spanish if I have no clue about the frequencies in English and Spanish. So that is why, and this is important, we also added some control data. And we did some comparisons with corpora of reference. In concrete, there is the Ameresco corpus. Ameresco is a combination of colloquial conversations. It's a project of the University of Valencia. And so they have Ameresco Mexico that we would use as a point of reference for the Spanish spoken in El Paso, of course. And we also look into Ameresco Cuba, so La Habana, as a point of reference for the Spanish possibly spoken in Miami. And then, of course, we also needed a corpus for American English. So we looked into the Santa Barbara corpus of spoken American English because, yeah, after a long search, we found that it's also almost the only one that really has those informal conversations. So again, not to compare apples with pears, you cannot study intensification in sociolinguistic interviews. These are just different forms that you will use. So I brought the 2 case studies. I will see how far we get. So there are some numbers. So sorry for the numbers. I think that the most important thing will be the take-home message at the end. Okay, so first of all, the diminutive constructions. So what happens in Spanish and English? So first in the monolingual system. So in Spanish, and I guess it's quite the same in Portuguese, the diminutive is really productive. They really like to add ito, iyo, at all kinds of bases. And so you can see that even in Spanish, proper names, Carlitos, so that's really normal, or even verbal forms. Andandito, which would mean I am walking slowly. That's not something that you would have in English, for instance. So it's really productive. And ito, so if you compare all the dialects overall, all Spanish dialects have ito as a preferred form, but then there is quite some variation. So here you can see the whole paradigm of synthetic diminutive affixes. And what is also typical of Spanish is that the diminutive tends to have a lot of different affective, subjective meanings. Ay, pobrecita. It's not a small, poor girl, but it's, I feel so sorry for you. And in fact, if you do pragmatic analysis, there are many nuances. Okay, let's go to English. There you have a totally different pattern. English does not really have suffixes. So here you can see which are the suffixes or prefixes used, but they are not frequent at all. So they don't really sound natural for English speakers. What they do have is analytic markers, little, small, tiny, etc. You also see that in English, they would not be added to a verb. So it's really the number of bases is more restricted. And the dominant use, the diminutive in English, is all about the reduction of the dimension. A little house is a little house. A little girl is a little girl. Could have an effective meaning, but it's certainly not that rich. So what happens in the mind of the bilingual speaker when all this comes together? Okay, so first of all, we looked into the patterns of code switching. So can you find something like a little casa? Would they do that? Would they add a suffix to a English base? Well, here I was a bit disappointed at the beginning because the project was about code switching in the diminutive. And so Margot ran into trouble because, after all her corpus work, where she found 900 tokens of a diminutive in Miami, almost 1,000 in El Paso. She came to see me and said, I have a problem. I only have 9 tokens of code switching in each corpora. How can I describe the underlying grammatical pattern? Okay, so we had to reinvent ourselves, of course. But I said, no, don't worry. This is also interesting. It just means that for the bilingual speaker, it's an uncommon switch site. And so they will resolve the conflict in another way. So not by combining one language with another language. So looking into patterns was hard, but even though with the 9 examples, we did. So no advanced statistics here. But we did observe some first community differences in the sense that in Miami, apparently, speakers have more freedom as to what they choose as the base and what kind of diminutive they use. Whereas in El Paso, there seems to be more restrictions. The pattern is, okay, you have a Spanish base, so casa, and if you want to code switch, you add an English marker. So these are some examples in Miami. Un little estante, lo cogiste a bit. Un part-timecito, give me a little risorte, little gordito, where you have a combination of diminutives. And this is really hard to pronounce. Famoso-ish, so it's approximative, so that's why it's a diminutive, famoso-ish. Or poquitito, I'm a poquitito burned out. You also see that sometimes they combine and do stacked diminutives. Okay, so direct changes, not so frequent. What about the indirect changes? So what is happening as to the productivity of the phenomenon? So here I worked with the monolingual corpora as a comparison. So what you see, I will always mark in blue the American English corpus, and then the green I reserved for the monolingual varieties, and then the bilingual variety is put in orange. So just looking at the normalized frequencies, we do see that apparently the Miami, so the number of times a speaker uses the diminutive, is in between the two extremes. So in Cuba, this confirms the high use by Spanish speakers. In Mexico, we have very similar numbers to Cuba. So this is good. It means that we are doing, our way of comparison was okay. And then we see that also El Paso is in between the two extremes. So if you put them on a scale as to high or low productivity, so you see that US English is the least productive. On the other hand of productivity, we find our monolingual varieties and our bilingual varieties. They are nicely placed in between. And you also see that the bilingual variety, it seems to follow a bit the profile of English dominant or Spanish dominant. So El Paso is Spanish dominant. It still likes the diminutive more than Miami bilinguals that maybe because of contact with English, try to avoid a bit the overuse of the diminutive. Okay, what about the dominant formation strategy? So synthetic or analytic. And here, of course, I have to separate within the bilingual speech, the Spanish tokens from the English tokens. So what do you see here? So the synthetic forms are the prefixes of the suffixes, the analytic forms. So we start with Cuba. And Cuba, when they use a diminutive, it's almost always a suffix or a prefix. There is a small reduction in Miami, which might be due to language contact, but it's not that in those bilingual communities, the synthetic resources are avoided overall. So there is a small reduction, but it's not huge. And the same applies to El Paso. So this is also interesting. So it might be a sign of indirect change, although it is a very slight decrease. Again, we can put them on a scale. So what do we see? The monolingual varieties clearly prefer the synthetic strategies, and Miami comes closer still to the synthetic strategies, whereas El Paso, at a bit lower, goes closer to the analytic pole, but it's still very close to the Spanish people. Okay, what about the English tokens? So English spoken in Miami, English spoken in El Paso. So in English, of course, the analytic strategy is dominant. That's not surprising, but a bit less. So maybe this is an effect of Spanish. And the same goes, no, not the same applies in El Paso. That's quite strange. So in El Paso, we see that the analytic strategies rise. So maybe speakers want to behave more like English speakers in El Paso, which in fact is against what we expected from the community norms. So this already shows that the picture that we will be drawing is not that simple. The message that I will bring here is not, oh, it's great, all the hypotheses are confirmed. I would have liked that, but it's not like that. The data are much more complex, of course, because the speakers within the communities are much more complex, and we are looking at the community level. So again, US English and El Paso bilinguals, when they speak English, they behave very similarly, followed by the Miami. And then the last thing was simply look at the paradigms. Do we have the same forms or not? So I will spare you the details. But what we see here is that in Miami, in the bilingual corpus, there are some forms that we found in Cuba, such as mini or ete as a typical suffix of Cuba, that no longer appear in Miami. But well, the question is this really significant or not? Maybe it's just because of the data. It's already hapax in that corpus. Maybe if we would look at more data, we would find it. So well, it's very small impacts, but you don't see a big change. So the bilingual variants are not that different from the monolingual ones. And the same applies when you look into the data from El Paso and compare it with Mexico. For English forms, the same. So we compared Santa Barbara with all the types that we found in Miami and El Paso, although there are some forms in Santa Barbara, such as bitty or minimal. So there seems to be less creativity as to different diminutives in the bilingual variant. So this maybe has to do with language change. But you always have to be careful when you talk about language change due to language content. Okay, so in a very similar mode, I will go faster just to compare, look into the intensification strategy. So the same reasoning applies, although not completely. Spanish loves to intensify. So it's huge, it's nice, it's very nice. So again, just like the diminutives, Spanish has intensification as a very productive phenomenon. Again, it can be added to many different categories: guapísimo, super temprano, re bien, etc. So very productive, many different forms, a lot of dialectal variation as to intensification. And we do, again, have the syntactic strategies: super, hyper, mega, ultra, re, rete, requete, etc. So they also use stacked forms, ísimo, on, azo, ote, and maybe you could find similar forms in Portuguese, but as opposed to what they do with the diminutives, they also are quite productive as to the lexical forms. So we have muy bien, and of course, again, the taboo words, so punto, un montón, de lo más, de mierda, pues, so they can really be very productive here as well. But overall, they have muy, super, and ísimo as default forms. And again, intensification in Spanish has affective subjective meanings. It's not always about, okay, this is a big house. No, it's about, it's really good, really bad, etc. So a lot of pragmatic nuances. English behaves quite similarly as to the diminutive. It has almost no suffixes and prefixes except for the super. So it's super great. So that is quite frequent. And that is also what is shared between Spanish and English. Let's see what a bilingual speaker does with that. But yeah, you also have as and zilla that they add, but they are really very creative. And then you have analytic markers, vary a lot, bloody, and the taboo words again. So even though, so you have a big variety, you could say that in English, if you would do quantitative analysis, the quantitative value is more important than the effective one, although it also has effective meaning. So it's a bloody, my bloody, I don't know, father-in-law. It has an effective meaning, but overall, the vary is like a dimension on a scale, and more than in Spanish. So I thought, okay, we started a second project. We will see the same patterns, but afterwards we saw some differences, and then I thought, oh, my starting point wasn't good, even though the project was approved. So the reviewers didn't notice it, but afterwards I was saying, okay, but I'm putting diminutive and intensification in the same sack, in the same bag, but they are quite different. And they might have an impact on the bilingual behavior, namely that, well, as to the phenomenon itself, as to the productivity, there is a difference, meaning that I told you earlier that the diminutive in Spanish is very frequent, in English it is not, but Spanish speakers, they like to intensify a lot, but English speakers as well. So in fact, that starting point shouldn't really have an impact. So they are quite different here. Another thing that we found afterwards is that, well, intensification is like an open paradigm. Every day, speakers create new intensifiers. So it's a constant cycle of grammaticalization. It's really very open. Whereas the diminutive is very closed and is also described in grammars. You can find a chapter on diminutives, but you cannot find a chapter on intensification. And then the last thing was that, yeah, I thought, oh, yeah, it's very easy. We have the analytic synthetic typology for both languages, but yeah, that's not true. Spanish also loves analytic strategies for intensification, but not for diminutives. So yeah, in fact, we were comparing apples with pears, but let's see if the results are then also different. Okay, what about the code switching? Maybe Simon had more luck and would find more tokens of code switching in the exact same corpora. So what did he tell me after one of the first meetings? Well, he told me literally, I have more tokens than Margot. And I said, yes, that's good, but no. He found 11 cases in Miami. That was more than the 9 for the diminutive. And he found 38 cases of code switch instances in El Paso. That is more than the 9 for the diminutive. But notice that intensification overall is more frequent than the corpora, than the diminutive strategy. So again, to do code switching research, well, it's not really a good thing to start. That's something that they will both, or did for Margot, evaluate through experiments. So then you really take out the code switch patterns and do an acceptability judgment task or whatever to see to what extent they would accept it or not. But we did find some differences as to the patterns. Again, in Miami, anything goes. But now in El Paso, there's also more variation. So intensification tends to be more varied than diminutive, which goes with the idea that, well, intensification is like a freer phenomenon. So here are some examples. Está muy modern, tan rude, de lo más clean. He was very machista. He's a freaking botanica, really jodido, talking Alberta, muy political, and then un pinche essay, un pinche, that of course is a form typical of Mexico, but that is repeated in the El Paso bilingual speech. Oh, so super fit. Super as a combined prefix between English and Spanish. Okay, what about the productivity? Interestingly, remember that for diminutive, we found that in Santa Barbara it was not frequent at all. And our idea that intensification in English is frequent is confirmed by the data, because it's more frequent in Santa Barbara, the intensification, than it is in Cuba. So Cubans, they love to use diminutives, but apparently not to intensify. And so the Miami variant is in between. Mexico does love intensification, or Mexican speakers. So apparently the frequency of intensification also varies among variants of Spanish. And El Paso is in between. So we get a totally different picture than what we found for the diminutive. Now, at the extremes, we have the monolingual varieties. We have English in between, and the bilingual varieties that tend to go with their original monolingual variant. So El Paso closer to Mexican Spanish, still quite frequent, and Miami bilingual to Cuban Spanish. Okay, what about the dominant formation strategy? So again, is there a reduction or not? So there is an overall dominance of analytic strategies. So also in Spanish, and that was not the case for the diminutive. So it really shows that the typology that we had originally in mind does not go here. Right? So they also prefer the lexical strategy, and it's even stronger in Miami than in Cuba, which might be due to contact with English. In El Paso, we had the same pattern. The analytic phenomenon is dominant, and it's even more also in Spanish, maybe because of contact with English. So again, if you would then compare all the colors, it is a different patterning or scale that you would get. What about this formation strategy in English? Well, it's not surprising, of course, to see that in English, as I said before, the prefixes and suffixes are hardly used. Even super is not that frequent, or lat or whatever. It is a bit more frequent in Miami. So this might be due to contact with Spanish, so that it is activated, even though in English, because the Spanish speakers do it more often. And so the same goes for others. So we always have to be tentative, but there seems to be slight differences going on. And this is what you would get if you would put them on the scale. And then the last question, and that will be the last slide with quantitative data. So what about the paradigms? Do they change? So here you see, for instance, that there are differences between Mexico and Cuba. So intensification has more variation among dialects than the diminutives, which also confirms what I said before. So you have typical prefixes and suffixes in Mexico, asco, udo, rete, that you would not find in Cuba. But you see that the bilingual variants, they keep them. So what you find in Cuba is also what you could find in Miami. So speakers tend to move on with their heritage suffixes in this case. And in English, do we have more forms? No, we don't. As to the synthetic ones, you see that even the super, as I said before, is not used that frequently. We did find in Miami some use of as and but, maybe because of taboo words. But I think since there are that small number of tokens, that it's simply due to the purpose. And then finally, the analytic form, so the type frequency. We see that there are many more types in English than there are in Spanish. And we see that particularly El Paso is very productive. We found 39 different analytic types, so that is bloody, hell, etc. More, or the same number as in Santa Barbara, more than in Miami, and much more than in the Spanish. Okay, so this comparison, where does it bring us? So I think that we can conclude that there were differences between Miami and El Paso, but that, I would have liked the idea, in Miami it's like this, and El Paso it's like that. No, so this is not the case. What we can conclude at a more abstract level is that the contact varieties, they retain traces of the original monolingual variety. So I think that was confirmed. Secondly, I think that all this shows that the bilingual varieties, they should be treated as varieties with their own right. They have a high degree of complexity. So the idea of the Creole languages that have a more simplified system, that would just use one strategy, or a reduced list of types, certainly does not apply. So I would certainly not say that Spanglish, or how you want to call it, is a Creole language. And this also repeats the idea that I showed at some point about the multilingualism, but also Ed Backus. And so he is a well-known cognitive contact linguistics linguist. He says that what we are doing is, in fact, with our monolingual mind, we are looking at multilingual data, but yeah, you should just study them as dialects and variants on their own. So the direct changes were not frequently observed, so it's no privileged area of code switching. Maybe that is why it wasn't underexplored. Maybe people said, oh, there is no code switching there, but still, it was interesting to see the indirect changes, and it depended on the nature of the linguistic phenomenon. So this also made us quite humble for the future in the fact that, well, whatever phenomenon, you have to do the research, and you cannot say that you will expect that it will go in this or the other direction, because it really depends on the nature of the phenomenon. So yeah, what will we do in the future? We have to combine all this with the social and sociolinguistic profiles. We want to know who are the speakers behind those different patterns. So we looked at the community level. We have to look at the speakers level, dominance of English and Spanish. How do they look at the different languages? So it's really an integrated approach. So yeah, there is still a lot of work to be done in the future. So yeah, thank you very much for your attention.